It was late afternoon in the cluttered, dimly lit lab of Dr. Mark H. Peterson, a man who had long made peace with being an oddity in the world of theoretical astronomy. A small, somewhat overlooked figure in the vast field of science, he was known for being eccentric, perpetually disheveled, and borderline obsessive in his research. His colleagues, when they remembered his name at all, called him the space nut behind his back. He didn't mind much. In fact, he often found their underestimation of him hilarious. He adjusted the thick black-framed glasses perched precariously on his nose and leaned forward over the microscope, squinting at the data on the screen. The digital readout flickered intermittently. A small, seemingly insignificant object, a speck of dust in the grand scheme of things, had caught his attention. It was the result of an experiment he'd been conducting for months, a miniaturized black hole particle. "You're so small, I could crush you with a sneeze," Mark muttered to himself. He wasn't talking to anyone, just the usual way he talked to his work. His voice echoed in the quiet of the lab. "But I'll be damned if you're not full of possibilities." A particle, no bigger than the tip of a pin, was rotating in the lab's makeshift containment field, a device he had cobbled together from spare parts and the remnants of a dozen failed experiments. Mark's work, while unconventional, had always fascinated him. Most people looked at black holes and saw destruction, the end of everything, a singularity that devoured all that ventured too close. But Mark had always been more optimistic, perhaps naively so. "Maybe you're the key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe," he said aloud, tapping at the holographic screen in front of him. "I wonder what would happen if—" He didn't finish his sentence. There was a faint whirring sound, and the particle began to pulsate. Mark frowned, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The containment field, which should have been steady, began to flicker, a subtle distortion in space and time growing around the particle. His heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong, something was very wrong. Before he could react, the particle surged forward, and in an instant, it shot toward him. "Shit," he yelped, backing away, but it was too late. The black hole particle flew straight into his open mouth, swallowed like a peanut down the throat of an unsuspecting giant. Mark staggered backward, grasping at his throat in disbelief. His breath came in sharp gasps as the tiny black hole settled inside him, its gravitational field no longer contained. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The lab grew unnervingly quiet, the hum of machines fading into nothingness. Mark blinked rapidly. His vision blurred, then sharpened again, and something was different. Something was wrong, but there was no time to figure it out. He stumbled toward the door, thinking he needed to leave the lab. But his hand was floating, suspended in midair. Mark stared at it in stunned confusion. His fingers weren't just floating, they were moving against the pull of gravity. He reached out, a sensation of weightlessness trickling up his arm as if it had been severed from the rest of his body. Slowly, he lifted his other hand. It too defied gravity, floating upwards like a balloon released into the wind. "What the hell is happening?" Mark whispered, now completely motionless in the middle of the lab, suspended in an invisible grip. It wasn't until the disembodied chair beside him began to drift upwards that it occurred to him, he was the cause of this. He blinked again. The chair hovered, rotated gently, and then drifted lazily to the corner of the lab. Mark didn't know whether to laugh or scream. The latter seemed more appropriate. The scientific part of his brain went into overdrive, but it didn't offer any solutions. He couldn't explain this. He could only feel it, the pull of the black hole particle in his body, twisting space, distorting time. His heart thudded in his chest. He wasn't just messing around with the laws of physics anymore, he had become an unwilling participant in a new kind of reality. Something that he had only dreamed of in his wildest theories was happening to him in the most unexpected, and possibly deadly, way. Mark's first instinct was to control it, to master it. He stretched out a hand, and with a thought, the pens on his desk began to hover, circling like small planets in the gravitational field he unknowingly wielded. A laugh bubbled up in his throat, though it was half panic. "I'm a god," he said, and then, for the briefest second, the horror of the situation set in. He wasn't a god. He was a man who had accidentally swallowed a black hole. He wasn't the master of his fate. He was something else. Something that could slip away at any moment, but for now, he had control. Mark concentrated, trying to move a stack of papers. They rose, the corners twitching upward in the air. A wave of excitement coursed through him. It was like magic, but real. He was controlling gravity, reversing it, bending it to his will. It didn't last. Within seconds, everything around him began to feel wrong. The room warped. The walls pressed in, breathing like they were alive. A low hum vibrated in the air, a sound he could feel in his bones. The gravity wasn't just reversing in the physical sense, it was bending reality itself, distorting the world around him. Mark's breath quickened as the sensation intensified. Was it the black hole? Was it him? He could feel his very consciousness beginning to fracture as the space around him warped and twisted, faster and faster. He had no time to react before he felt his body lurch. The force of it sent him tumbling backward, his legs giving way, his arms flailing. The gravitational pull was no longer under his control. "Stop," Mark gasped. "Please, stop." But the more he resisted, the more the force intensified. A sudden dizziness overwhelmed him, like the universe was tilting sideways. He clutched his head, feeling like his mind was being sucked into a black void, the gravity, his own gravity, pulling him deeper and deeper into the unknown. He had to get out, but his body was no longer obeying him. He couldn't even stand, much less run, and then, everything went black. When Mark came to, the world was an endless expanse of swirling blackness. It felt like he was suspended in some kind of void, a pocket of nothingness where sound and light had been sucked into an abyss, leaving only silence. His body felt detached, weightless, floating in a way that was neither comforting nor natural. He tried to move his arms, but there was no resistance. No sensation at all. It was as if his limbs no longer existed in the physical sense, just vague extensions of his will, without substance. A thrum pulsed in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It felt like the heartbeat of something larger, something incomprehensible. Mark squinted, or at least tried to, though his vision didn't seem to function in the usual way anymore. Everything was abstract, like looking at the world through a fogged-up window. "Am I dead?" Mark whispered, the words feeling unfamiliar in his mouth, as if his vocal cords were no longer entirely his own. His thoughts were sluggish, disconnected, as if they were being pulled apart by invisible forces. The black hole, his black hole, had done something to him, something that no theory or equation could explain. He could feel it. It was inside him, beyond his reach, but ever present. The more he tried to grasp it, the further it receded, like a shadow in the corner of his mind. Slowly, cautiously, he began to push against the emptiness. There was something pulling at him, a force, something familiar but indescribable. It wasn't gravity in the traditional sense. It was a warping, a bending of reality, something that tugged at his very consciousness. He tried to remember what had happened, but the memory felt distant, like a dream he couldn't quite recall. A lab. The black hole particle. His mouth. Swallowed. How? Why? The questions tumbled through his mind like dice bouncing on the floor of a dark room. He grasped at the fragments of memory, but they slipped through his fingers, just out of reach. He focused again, trying to push against the force. His legs, if he had legs, seemed to stretch outward, like they were being elongated and pulled in opposite directions. For a moment, the sensation was almost unbearable, a sickening pull at his core. Then, as quickly as it had come, it stopped. Mark gasped. He was falling, except it didn't feel like falling. It wasn't the kind of freefall he knew from experience. There was no wind, no ground beneath him, no sense of weight. He wasn't just moving through space. He was becoming part of it. It was as though he was slipping through layers of reality, the laws of physics bending, folding over themselves like the pages of a book someone had forgotten to read. He couldn't stop it. He didn't know how. And then, just as suddenly, his body slammed back into itself. It wasn't a violent impact, but a sudden return to the world he knew. The world where gravity worked the way it should, where time moved forward at a predictable pace. But it wasn't quite the same. His body felt wrong, like he was wearing someone else's skin. And the room, was this even his lab anymore, felt alien, as though it had been stretched out, distorted. He stumbled to his feet, his hands outstretched to steady himself against the walls, but the walls seemed to bend away from him. The lab stretched and warped, the angles of the desks and chairs rippling like a reflection in a pool of water disturbed by a stone. God, what is happening to me? Mark muttered, his voice cracking. But no one answered. He was alone. He looked down at his hands, watching in stunned disbelief as his fingers seemed to ripple, flickering like a bad signal on an old television. He rubbed his eyes, but the sensation didn't change. His hands remained translucent, like something that shouldn't exist, something that was both part of him and not. He took a deep breath, his chest expanding with an effort that seemed unnatural, as though he was inflating a balloon with each inhale. His heart was pounding in his ears, but the sensation of himself, of being whole, was slipping further away. It wasn't just his body anymore. It was his mind. His thoughts felt fragmented, like they were slipping through his consciousness faster than he could keep up. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. This wasn't just the black hole messing with gravity. This was something far more dangerous. His mind was warping. His very sense of self was unraveling, piece by piece. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of his own thoughts growing heavier and more alien. And with each passing moment, his grip on his own reality seemed to slip away. The lab around him shifted again. The objects on the desks, papers, pens, his computer, were twisting and distorting, defying the physical laws he knew to be true. And they weren't just moving in space. They were moving in time, skipping across moments as though they were flickering in and out of existence. Is this what it feels like to be consumed by a black hole? Mark asked, but the question felt pointless. There was no one there to answer, no way to make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, he was no longer alone. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, a blurry, shifting silhouette that didn't belong. It was a person, but not a person, its features constantly changing, melting in and out of shape. It was like looking at a mirage, a distortion in the fabric of reality itself. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Who are you?" he croaked, but the figure didn't answer. It only seemed to move closer, its presence pulling at the very air around him, as if it were feeding off his confusion, his fear. Mark took a step back, but his legs felt like they were moving through thick syrup. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't listen. He couldn't escape. He couldn't even wake up from whatever nightmare this had become. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers stretching unnaturally, like they were made of something more fluid than flesh. It was reaching for him, pulling at the edges of his reality, and Mark instinctively recoiled, trying to get away. But he was frozen in place. Helpless, the figure's hand brushed against his cheek, and in that instant, it felt like everything inside him was ripped away. Like the very fabric of his consciousness was being torn open. His vision went dark again, but this time, there was no blackness. There was no void. There was only nothing. And then, a sharp pain, the kind that lances through your skull, making everything feel like it's collapsing inward, ripped through him. His body convulsed, his breath caught in his chest. The figure's presence, the one thing that had been pulling at him, disappeared. The room around him returned to focus, the shifting walls and distorted objects snapping back into place like a rubber band snapping back into shape. Mark gasped for air, his mind reeling. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, or if time was even real anymore. The black hole inside him seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and for the first time, Mark wondered if the black hole wasn't just inside him, it had become him. He could feel it, deep within himself, twisting him up. There was no escape. There was no stopping it. Mark had crossed a line, and now, he was its prisoner. His hand shot out, instinctively grabbing the nearest object, his coffee mug, and hurled it toward the far wall. It was as though the very act of doing it was too slow, the object moving at a pace faster than he could comprehend. It shattered on impact, but the shards didn't fall to the ground. They hovered there, suspended in mid-air, spinning slowly, suspended by an unseen force. Mark laughed bitterly. The irony was almost poetic. He had created this. He had sought to understand the universe, to decode the mysteries of space, and now, here he was, at the mercy of a force he couldn't even begin to comprehend. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part was the thought that, if he didn't find a way to control this, he might disappear, swallowed up completely by the black hole inside of him. His mind. His body. His very existence and the universe. It would carry on, indifferent, as it always had, but Mark couldn't let go. Not yet. Not when he had only just begun to understand the power he held. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on, but he would try. He had no choice. The black hole inside Mark had become something more than just an anomaly. It was a constant presence, a nagging hum deep within his chest, thrumming with power. He could feel it shifting, reshaping everything around him. It wasn't merely affecting his body anymore, it was pulling at his mind, twisting the very fabric of his thoughts. The universe was bending around him, and he was powerless to stop it. He tried to focus, but his mind felt like a rubber band stretched too thin. Every attempt to ground himself in reality, every effort to hold on to his previous life, to his sanity, slipped further away. His body no longer obeyed simple commands. His limbs, his hands, his fingers, he could barely make sense of them. Were they his? Were they even real? They flickered in and out of existence, the lines between solid and phantom growing blurrier with each passing moment. Mark looked around the lab again, half expecting everything to dissolve into nothingness. The chairs were still suspended in mid-air, the pens and books frozen in time, caught in the gravitational pull of something he could no longer control. It was as if he had unwittingly activated a cosmic mechanism, one that had no off switch, no way to rewind the damage he had caused. He reached out, not sure what he expected to achieve, but as his hand moved toward the edge of the desk, the wood stretched like taffy, elongating and distorting into an impossible shape. It felt real, too real. His fingers pressed against it, and the surface rippled like water. He pulled back quickly, but not before feeling a strange warmth that radiated from the desk into his arm, like the object was absorbing his very essence. The sensation was dizzying. Mark staggered backward, instinctively grasping for something solid. His body lurched, sending him crashing into a wall. But when his back met the surface, it didn't feel like a wall at all. It felt like a memory. A distant echo of something once familiar. Mark blinked and stepped away, disoriented. The walls were still there, but they were fading in and out of his vision, as though the lab were caught in some kind of time loop. The air around him hummed, and he felt himself being pulled toward something, though he couldn't identify what it was. He had no frame of reference anymore. Everything was bending, folding in on itself. It was like standing on the edge of reality, peering into an abyss, unsure whether he would fall in or be spat back out. The black hole inside him pulsed, this time with a sharp, almost painful pressure. Mark gritted his teeth, his chest tight, trying to breathe through the sensation. His hands were trembling, his mind a blur. Every inch of his being screamed for him to let go, to stop fighting against it, but he couldn't. He had to understand. He had to know why this was happening to him. Why can't I stop it? He whispered, his voice cracking. The sound felt strange, like his own words were being distorted, stretched thin. He closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on trying to connect with something, anything. Some tether to reality, something solid enough to hold on to. He had no idea how long he stood there, eyes squeezed shut, body vibrating with the force of the gravity inside him. But when he finally opened them again, the lab had changed, completely. It wasn't just the objects in the room that had been affected. The air itself seemed to have been altered, the light bending in strange, impossible ways. The very space around him felt different. His eyes couldn't adjust fast enough, like he was suddenly seeing in multiple dimensions at once. Colors that shouldn't exist flared in his peripheral vision, and shadows twisted unnaturally on the walls. He tried to step forward, but his body felt sluggish, like he was moving through thick syrup. It wasn't the weightlessness he had experienced earlier. This was something else, something heavier, as if gravity had taken on an entirely new form. Mark's body seemed to resist every movement, as though the air itself had thickened, become more viscous. The more he tried to push forward, the more it felt like the world was pushing back, folding in on itself in ways he couldn't comprehend. The door to the lab, his only way out, stood before him. But it wasn't his door anymore. It was stretched, warped, its edges bending like a piece of paper left too long in the rain. Mark reached out a hand, fingers trembling, and when he touched the handle, it melted into his palm. His skin crawled, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. It wasn't just the door that was dissolving, it was everything around him. He could feel the very molecules in the air shifting, splitting apart. His heart was pounding in his chest now. His vision was going in and out, flashes of light, real? Unreal? He wasn't sure anymore, searing into his eyes. He staggered back from the door, his breath ragged, and felt his knees buckle under him. He collapsed to the floor, the world spinning around him, colors bleeding into one another. He was losing it. His grasp on reality was slipping. The black hole inside him had already begun to dissolve everything he thought he knew, from his perception of space to his very consciousness. Mark curled into himself, trying to steady his breathing, but it was no use. He was drowning in it. In the black hole, in the pull of his own unraveling existence. But as the seconds passed, a strange calm began to settle over him. His panic began to subside, the edges of his mind starting to fray less violently. The air grew strangely still, the pressure mounting within him becoming quieter, less suffocating. He still couldn't control it, he wasn't even sure if he wanted to, but something inside him, some deeper part of himself, had accepted it. Accepted the fact that this was the new reality. He was not just a man with an accidental connection to a black hole. He was the black hole. Or rather, it was him. A thought, fleeting and elusive, surfaced in his mind. What if the black hole isn't trying to destroy me? What if it's trying to teach me? The idea made no logical sense, but the longer he sat there, enveloped in the stillness of the warped lab, the more it seemed to make sense. He wasn't being consumed by the black hole, not entirely. He was merging with it. Becoming part of it. What if this was his evolution? What if he wasn't meant to escape it, but to learn from it, to harness it in ways no one had ever imagined? He couldn't answer those questions. But the pull, the pressure, the strange calm that had settled over him, it was enough for him to take a chance. For the first time since everything had gone wrong, Mark felt a flicker of hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The lab seemed to slow down around him. The distorted air, the shifting walls, the floating objects, everything stilled. For a moment, everything was frozen in place. And in the stillness, Mark felt a wave of clarity wash over him. He wasn't sure what he would do next. He wasn't even sure if he could. But he had one thing left: control over himself. The black hole inside him had warped everything he knew about space, time, and reality. But it hadn't taken away his will. He could still decide what came next. It was small, but it was something, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Mark took a deep breath, let go of the fear, and reached out, not to push the world away, but to embrace it. He wasn't sure where it would take him. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Mark took another deep breath, and this time, it wasn't just air filling his lungs. He could feel the pulse of the black hole inside him, throbbing with an energy he could no longer ignore. It wasn't just the force of gravity anymore, it was something else entirely, a presence that seemed to understand him on a level deeper than anything he could articulate. It was as if the black hole, this cosmic force that he had so fearfully tried to contain, was reaching out to him, asking him to understand it, but that was the problem, wasn't it? He had spent so long trying to control it, trying to push it away. Now, the black hole wasn't something external, it was inside him, inside his very being. It was no longer a force to be feared or manipulated. It was a part of him. His body and mind were linked to it, bound in ways that defied logic, defied time itself. The lab had stopped warping. The walls, the furniture, the air around him had settled back into some semblance of normalcy. But it wasn't the normal he knew. It was a different kind of reality, one where the laws of physics were no longer absolute, where time could twist and bend at will. The world outside his body might still function according to the familiar rules, but within him, within his mind, those rules were irrelevant. His body felt more solid now, though still not quite his own. His limbs moved with a strange grace, as if they were learning how to move in this new world of warped gravity. Every motion felt like it was stretching time itself, like he was moving through a space that didn't have the same constraints anymore. He had no idea how much longer this feeling would last, but for the first time since the black hole had entered his life, Mark felt like he was gaining some kind of understanding. Slowly, he stood up, his knees buckling slightly, still unused to the sensation of gravity, or the lack of it. His feet met the ground with a quiet thud, but even that felt wrong, too heavy and too light all at once. He had been pulled between so many states of being, it was hard to distinguish one from the other. But in that disorientation, there was clarity. A deep, almost meditative awareness. The chaos of the world around him had ceased to matter. It was as though he was floating above it all, viewing it through the lens of the black hole's infinite perspective. The lab stretched out in front of him, the objects floating in mid-air, the shadows in the corners of the room, none of it was as it seemed. Every object, every molecule, existed not just in the present moment but in all possible moments. The past and future were no longer linear. They were stacked on top of one another, layered in a dizzying collage of spacetime that he could now perceive, if only dimly. He flexed his fingers, focusing on the pens that hovered across the room, just beyond his reach. With a quiet concentration, he extended his hand, and slowly, the pens moved toward him. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, no flashy display of cosmic power. It was controlled, subtle, like he was coaxing them toward him, using his connection to the black hole to influence the gravitational pull on the objects. They drifted toward him, floating lazily through the air until they landed softly in his palm. Mark closed his hand around them, and the sensation that washed over him was one of profound unity. It wasn't just the pens or the objects in the room. It was the world, the very fabric of space and time itself, that was within his grasp. And yet, for all the power he felt, there was no overwhelming urge to use it, no hunger to control it. In that moment, he realized something essential: the power wasn't the point. Understanding was. He turned toward the large whiteboard in the far corner of the room, the one he had filled with scribbles and equations over the years, hoping to understand the nature of black holes, of gravity, of time itself. The board was no longer just a place for his theoretical work. It was a portal, a door that led to the greater understanding he had always sought, but never fully grasped, until now. Mark slowly walked over to it, the pens floating easily in his hand, and with a steady hand, he began to write. At first, it was just the familiar equations, the ones he had always relied on, the gravitational constant, the equation for Hawking radiation, the calculations for event horizons. But soon, his writing took on a new direction. He wasn't just writing out equations. He was writing the language of the universe itself. It was as if the black hole within him had opened a new channel for understanding, one that allowed him to perceive the hidden connections between everything. He could see the threads that wove the cosmos together, the invisible lines that held galaxies in place, the faint pulses of energy that drifted through time and space. He could see how everything was connected, how the universe was not a series of isolated events, but an intricate, living system. The board was now covered in a complex, flowing script, symbols, equations, and diagrams that seemed to breathe, shift, and fold into each other. Mark had never seen anything like it before. It wasn't just theoretical physics, it was something more, something that couldn't be captured by words or numbers alone. It was the essence of reality itself, its deepest, most fundamental truths. Mark stood there for a long moment, staring at the board. He wasn't sure if he had written this. Part of him felt like he had, but another part of him wondered if the black hole had done it for him, guiding his hand through some greater intelligence that was both alien and familiar. The boundaries between him and the black hole were growing thinner, the lines of separation blurring. It was as though he was no longer Mark Peterson, the man who had studied the stars and tried to understand the mysteries of space. Now, he was a part of something larger, something that transcended individual consciousness. He was a part of the black hole itself. He looked down at his hands again, the pen still floating gently in his palm. They hadn't moved on their own. He had made them move, but they had responded to something deeper within him. The black hole inside him had become his tool, not in a way that he had once envisioned, controlling the world around him, but in a way that made him part of it. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant in the universe's grand design. A small, almost imperceptible smile curled at the corners of his lips. It was a smile of understanding, not triumph. There was no joy in controlling the forces of the universe. There was only peace in knowing that he had finally touched the heart of it, but just as quickly as the calm had settled over him, something shifted. The black hole inside him pulsed again, sending a wave of disorientation crashing over him. This time, though, it wasn't painful. It was just different. The sense of unity he had felt was no longer there. The lab, once again, began to warp and twist, the objects around him dissolving into formless shapes. His vision blurred, and the board with its intricate equations began to fade, becoming nothing more than a smear of light in the periphery of his sight. It was happening again, but this time, Mark didn't panic. He didn't fight it. Instead, he took a step forward, reaching out to the shifting world around him, willing himself to move with it, to flow with the change instead of resisting it. And as the black hole's grip on his mind tightened once more, Mark did something that he had never thought possible. He let go.